I have been told more than once that I am a patient creature. I think this is meant as a compliment. I have come to understand that among the Vethelin, patience is not a virtue so much as a fact of biology. We are a slow species by human reckoning, our breeding cycles measured in Federation standard years rather than months, our memory retention significantly better than our forward momentum. We do not rush. We also do not forget. The humans who said it to me, and there were several, over the course of the 2 years I spent in the corridor outside Room 7 of the Resettlement and Welfare Processing Office, Keth Station Aren 2, said it in the tone of people who were slightly impressed and slightly ashamed, and not entirely sure which feeling to lead with. They said it while stepping around me on their way to their desks. They said it while I was sitting on the bench I came to think of as mine, holding my daughter Velsareth Min, who was 3 Federation standard years old when we arrived and 5 when we left, and who learned to read sitting beside me in that corridor under the light from the window at the far end of the hall. I am telling you this so you understand the shape of the thing, not the injustice of it. I am not particularly interested in injustice as a subject of narration, and in any case the review board's 94-page report has already covered that ground with admirable thoroughness. I am interested in the comedy of it. 2 years, a bench, a window, a door. And then one morning, a woman named Agnes Muir arrived 40 minutes before her shift was supposed to start, looked down the corridor, saw me sitting there as I had been sitting there for the better part of 2 Federation standard years and said, "Come in." That was it, that was the thing. I have thought about it a great deal since. We arrived at Keth Station Aren 2 on the morning of the 14th day of the 3rd month of Federation, standard year 247. I know the date precisely because I wrote it in the small cloth-covered notebook I carry, which I have kept since Min was born as a record of things I do not want to forget, and which now contains approximately 200 pages of observations about human institutional behavior that I did not originally set out to gather, but which accumulated as a natural consequence of having nothing else to do. The station was not what I had expected. I do not know precisely what I had expected, something more deliberate, perhaps more purposeful. Keth Station Aren 2 is a transit and processing hub for the outer Aren sector, which means it is the kind of place that handles a great many things efficiently and a few things very badly. And the determining factor for which category any given thing falls into is largely whether there is an existing form for it. If there is an existing form, Keth Station Aren 2 will process your case with brisk, courteous competence. If there is not an existing form, Keth Station Aren 2 will create a file, assign it a number, and place it in a category called pending further classification, which is the administrative equivalent of a very deep shelf in a room nobody visits. There was not an existing form for me. The Vethelin Resettlement Protocol, which governs the processing of Vethelin individuals seeking Federation resettlement status, was written in Federation Standard Year 201 for a specific subset of Vethelin subgroups. The Keth lineage, primarily, and the Aren branch secondary lines, who have a 40-year history of Federation integration and whose documentation requirements are well understood. The Sareth lineage, of which I am a member, are a more recent addition to the Federation's awareness. We come from a different part of Vethelin space. Our civic documentation format does not map cleanly onto the Keth Aren templates. Our displacement origin codes, and I had 2 of them, which the standard form had 1 field for, did not exist in the intake system's reference table. The intake officer on the morning of our arrival was a young human named Casimir Bauer-Petrov, 26 years old, with the particular expression of someone who has been told the system handles everything and has recently discovered it does not handle this. He processed my paperwork with genuine care. He entered what he could, left blank what he couldn't, and at the end of it he looked at me across the desk with the expression I would come to recognize as the standard human response to a situation that the form did not prepare for, which is a kind of earnest helplessness that I find, in retrospect, rather endearing. He told me the case would need to be reviewed by a senior caseworker. He said this would take some time. He gave me a case reference number, ARR2WEL2 47391, and he told me to check back in a few days. He did not tell me to wait in the corridor. I want to be clear about that. No one told me to wait in the corridor. The bench was simply there in the corridor outside room 7, and I was there, and Min was there, and we had nowhere else to be that morning, and so we sat down. A few days passed. I came back. The senior caseworker had been on leave. There was a new intake form that needed to be completed. The new form also had a field for displacement origin codes that did not include mine. I sat down on the bench again. This is how it began, not with hostility, not with anyone telling me I could not proceed. Simply with the machinery of a bureaucracy encountering a category it did not recognize and doing what such machinery always does. It continued moving, processing the things it knew how to process, and left the thing it did not know how to process in a state of suspension that was not quite active and not quite resolved, and therefore required no particular decision to maintain. In 23 months, no one made a decision about my case. In 23 months, 4 different caseworkers were assigned to my file, and 4 different caseworkers were reassigned away from it before completing their review. I know this because the station's administrative display in the corridor, a small screen mounted near the ceiling that shows queue status and case assignment updates, cycled through this information in rotating 15-minute windows, and I had nothing else to read for most of the first year. ARR2WEL2 47391, caseworker pending assignment. ARR2WEL2 47391, caseworker assigned Ref. Bauer Petrov C. ARR2WEL2 47391, caseworker reassigned Ref. Administrative transfer. This went on. I filled the notebook. The corridor outside room 7 of the Resettlement and Welfare Processing Office is approximately 14 meters long and 2.4 meters wide, with a window at the far end that faces the station's outer ring and catches the light from the Arendt secondary star for approximately 4 hours each day, beginning at roughly the equivalent of mid-morning in station time. The floor is tiled in a pale gray material that scratches easily. I could tell you by the end of the first year exactly which tiles had the deepest scratches and what pattern they made when the light came through the window at the correct angle. There are 3 other benches in the corridor, spaced along the wall opposite the office doors. I sat on the one nearest the window. This was not sentiment. The other benches were closer to the foot traffic from the main corridor junction, which carries a significant throughput of station personnel in the morning and early afternoon, and the window bench was quieter. It also had better light for reading to Min, which I began doing in the second month because the Federation Education datapad I had packed was insufficient for a 3-year-old who had decided she wanted to know what letters were. The things I observed from the bench would fill several notebooks on their own, and some of them did. I observed that human institutional workers arrive in a predictable pattern based on their level of seniority. The youngest workers arrive earliest because they are anxious. The middle-ranking workers arrive on time because they are professional, and the senior workers arrive last because they have stopped worrying about it. I observed that the coffee-equivalent machine in the break room adjacent to room 7 is used by approximately 90% of workers within the first 12 minutes of their shift, which tells you something about the role of ritual in human institutional culture that I will not belabor. I observed that humans have a pronounced tendency to look at their screens rather than at the corridor when they pass through it, which means that the thing on the bench can be quite large. I am not a small person, by Vethlan standards or human ones, and still not register as something that requires a response. I am a cephalopod-adjacent species, if you are mapping us onto a human biological reference frame, which I gather most humans do find helpful. I have 8 primary limbs, 4 of which function as arms and 4 as ambulatory supports. My mantle is approximately the size of a large human torso, and my skin coloration responds to my emotional state in ways I have, over many years, learned to keep fairly neutral in professional settings. In the corridor, I kept my color at a steady pale silver gray, which is close to the tone of the walls, and is also the color I default to when I am being patient. Min, who does not yet have full control of her chromatic responses, was considerably more interesting to watch. She went through a period of vivid copper when she was frustrated, which was frequently, and a soft, warm amber when she was reading, which became increasingly frequent as the months passed and the datapad library expanded. She also went through a period of vivid green when she was happy, which I noted with some relief in the 5th month, because it meant she had found something to be happy about, which at that point required rather more deliberate engineering on my part than I had anticipated. I should explain what I mean when I say the office was not ignoring us. I mean this technically. The office was aware of our presence. Several caseworkers nodded to me as they passed. One of them, a woman named Hiroko Takeshimos, who worked the reception desk in room 7 during months 3 through 11, learned Min's name and brought her a piece of fruit on 4 separate occasions. I do not want to suggest the humans in that corridor were unkind people. They were not. They were people doing their jobs in a system that had not assigned them the task of dealing with us, and who accordingly dealt with us in the way humans deal with things that are present but not yet in their queue. They were pleasant, and they went about their work. The difference, which I do not think any of them noticed at the time, was that going about their work meant going into room 7 and closing the door. I became something of an expert in closed doors during this period. I will tell you what I know about the door to room 7 specifically, which is a standard Federation institutional door in pale brushed composite, with a frosted transparency panel in the upper third, and a small plaque reading resettlement, and welfare processing, KETH station ARRN2, Office 7 in the Federation standard font. The door has a sensor-activated opener set to respond to station-issued personnel badges, which means it opens automatically for staff and requires a manual request, pressing the contact panel on the left side of the frame, for visitors. I pressed the contact panel on the left side of the frame on 14 separate occasions during the first 6 months. On each of those occasions, I was directed back to the bench to wait for an available caseworker. In month 7, I stopped pressing the contact panel, not from despair. I want to be clear about this. I stopped because I had calculated that pressing the contact panel was producing no useful outcomes and was consuming a portion of my morning that I could use more productively. I began spending that time instead teaching Min to write. I am aware this might look, from a certain angle, like defeat. I did not experience it as defeat. I experienced it as information management. The corridor was a closed system producing no outputs relevant to my case. The caseworkers who passed through it were operating within a different closed system, whose outputs were similarly not reaching me. The only productive system available to me was the notebook, the datapad, and Min, all of which I could influence directly, and so I focused there. By month 10, Min could write her own name in Federation Standard and in Vethalan Sareth script. By month 14, she had read through the entire child-level section of the datapad library and was beginning to work into the intermediate texts. By month 18, she had developed opinions about comparative narrative structure in children's literature that I found, to be honest, more sophisticated than several academic papers I had read on the subject, and which I transcribed into the notebook because I did not want to forget them. The notebook was full by month 20. I had to purchase a second one from the station commissary. I should say something about the commissary, because it is relevant to the shape of the thing. Keth Station or Ren2 has a commissary on the residential level that serves the station population, and is, technically, accessible to registered case files as well as to station residents. I discovered this in month 4, when I found the relevant subsection in the Federation Resettlement Administrative Code, which I had read in its entirety by month 3. The subsection specifies that individuals with active Federation case reference numbers are entitled to basic provisions access at standard Federation welfare allocation rates. The commissary personnel were, when I explained this to them, uncertain but not unwilling. They checked with their supervisor. Their supervisor checked with the welfare division. The welfare division confirmed the allocation. I was given a weekly provisions card for myself and for Min. This is the sort of thing I mean. No one had told me I was entitled to the provisions allocation. I found it by reading the code. Once I presented the relevant subsection to the relevant personnel and walked them through the applicable clauses, it was processed within 40 minutes. The system had not been hiding it from me. The system simply had not told me about it because the system's outreach protocols did not include proactive communication with case files in the pending further classification category. The system was waiting for a caseworker to open my file and initiate the standard welcome sequence. The caseworker was waiting for an assignment. The assignment was waiting for a senior review that had been rescheduled 3 times due to administrative load. Everything was waiting for everything else. Min and I ate reasonably well and waited on the bench. I also discovered in month 6 that there was a supplementary medical allocation available to displaced individuals with active case numbers, covering basic health assessments for dependents under 10 Federation standard years of age. I found this in Appendix C of the Resettlement Administrative Code, subsection 7, footnote 4. The footnote was brief and easy to miss. I presented it to the welfare allocation desk on the residential level, along with a typed summary of the applicable clauses and Min's existing case-linked documentation, and the medical appointment was scheduled within a week. The welfare allocation officer who processed this, a compact, brisk woman named Yeva Parkos, who appeared to subsist entirely on the contents of a small tin of crackers she kept in her desk drawer, looked at the footnote I had printed, and then looked at me and said, with the precise neutrality of a professional who is surprised and is choosing not to show it, "You read the appendices." I told her I had a good deal of time to read. She made a small sound that I have come to recognize, across many months of corridor observation, as the human version of finding something simultaneously reasonable and quietly remarkable. She stamped the form. Min's first medical appointment was the following Thursday. The doctor who saw her, a young man named Preet Vashtiarora who was new to the station and had not yet acquired the habit of looking at the corridor display rather than at the patient, spent 40 minutes with Min and gave her a clean bill of health and a small stuffed animal of indeterminate species origin that he said he kept in his bag for young patients who had been waiting longer than expected. He did not know how long we had been waiting. I did not tell him. Min named the stuffed animal corridor, which was her idea, and which I wrote in the notebook as one of the more accurate pieces of nomenclature I had encountered in 6 months. By month 9, I had read the Resettlement Administrative Code, its 3 main appendices, and the 7 supplementary guidelines attached to the AREN sector implementation protocols. I had also, through the station's publicly accessible legal reference terminal, which is on the residential level and which no one had told me about, but which I found by following a corridor worker who was carrying a folder with a legal reference sticker on the cover, and appeared to know where she was going. Read the Federation Charter's provisions on the rights of individuals with active case file numbers in administrative processing. Section 14 of the Charter specifies that such individual retain full access to all publicly available station services and facilities for which they meet the criteria. I took detailed notes. In month 10, I used Section 14 to successfully petition for Min's access to the station's supervised recreation program, which operates on the residential level 3 afternoons per week. The petition required 2 forms and a case number verification. The recreation coordinator, a cheerful man named Benedict Holmes Sorensen, who had not previously encountered a petition filed under Section 14 of the Federation Charter, and said so with the specific brightness of someone who considers this interesting rather than inconvenient, processed it in one afternoon. He gave Min a program schedule and a locker number for her bag. Min, who had been spending her afternoons either reading on the bench or doing structured exercises I had designed for her in the notebook, attended her first recreation session on a Thursday and came back speaking, tentatively and with considerable mispronunciation, 7 words in a language I later identified as a Cathari branch dialect that the other children in the program used among themselves. She also came back a steady, warm amber, which is the color she goes when she has had a good day. By month 12 I had submitted, using the provisions of Appendix F of the Resettlement Administrative Code, a formal request for inclusion in the station's non-residential education program, which provides instruction to children of registered case file holders at no additional cost. The request was approved in 6 weeks, delayed primarily by the need to confirm whether the non-residential provision applied to PFC category case files or only to resolved ones. I cited subsection 3 of Appendix F, which does not make this distinction. The approval came through. Min began attending instruction sessions in the station's educational annex on alternate mornings, which meant she was not always in the corridor with me, which meant the corridor was quieter, and I had more time to write. I wrote about the corridor. I wrote about the people who passed through it. I wrote about the case reference display cycling its 15-minute updates, and about the scratch tiles, and about the quality of the light in the afternoon, and about the specific cadence of footsteps that means someone is late for something versus the slightly different cadence that means someone is carrying something heavy versus the almost identical cadence that means someone has just received bad news and is walking carefully to avoid showing it. I wrote observations about human institutional culture that were, I gradually recognized, becoming fairly detailed, and which were shaping into something that more closely resembled a systematic study than personal notes. I wrote about the intake form reference table discrepancy, which I had by now mapped in its entirety against the Federation Civic Reference System's current code library. I documented precisely which codes were absent from the REN2 table when they had been added to the main system, and what category of applicant each missing code applied to. I wrote about the 3 other PFC category cases I had identified from the corridor display, noting their reference number date ranges, the pattern of their caseworker assignment updates, and what the timing suggested about their likely classification issues. I cross-referenced the information with the intake protocol documentation I had found on the public terminal and assembled, over the course of months 13 and 14, what amounted to a reasonably complete picture of the structural gap in the REN2 intake system and its likely effects. I did not know at the time what I would do with any of this. I wrote it down because it seemed important to have a record of it, and because the Vethelin relationship to memory is such that we tend, when we cannot act, to document, which is its own form of keeping a thing alive. The notebook was not a strategy. It was simply what I did with the hours, the same way Min collected tiles for their scratch patterns and Tamaz drank his coffee and Agnes Muir, whom I did not know yet, drank her tea every morning in a quiet corridor 4 stations away and waited for the working day to begin. In month 16, a new batch of caseworkers arrived from the Federation's administrative training program. One of them, a young man named Tamaz Ferrer Nkosi, who had recently completed his placement year, and had the look of someone who had not yet learned that the correct response to an unexpected situation is to create a form, was assigned the early morning shift in Room 7's outer reception area. His job was to manage the queue and handle initial intake for walk-in cases. On his second morning, he noticed me. I do not mean he saw me. Everyone saw me. I mean, he looked at me in the specific way that means a person has registered that what they are seeing is a thing requiring thought rather than a thing to walk past. He stopped. He looked at Min. Min looked back at him with the frank, unblinking attention she applies to everything she considers worth studying, which at that point was most things. He said, in the slightly too loud voice humans sometimes use with individuals whose primary language is not standard, "Good morning." I said good morning. He asked whether I was waiting to be seen. I said I had a case reference number and had been waiting to be seen for approximately 16 months. He said, and this is a quote I have in the notebook, "Oh." Tomás Ferrer Nkosi was, I learned over the following weeks, a genuinely conscientious young man who was troubled by what he had learned and who also, unfortunately, did not have the authority to do anything about it. He pulled up my file on the intake display. He read it. He read it again. He told me the file had been in pending further classification since month 1. I told him I was aware of this. He told me he was going to escalate it to his supervisor. I told him that would be the 4th escalation in 16 months, and that I would be interested to see what came of it. He escalated it to his supervisor. His supervisor, a competent woman named Larissa Obi Johansen, who was running a section that was significantly understaffed, reviewed the file, confirmed that it required senior review, added a priority flag, and scheduled it for the next available senior review slot, which was 6 weeks out. The 6-week slot was postponed due to a station-wide administrative review of RN sector intake protocols. The postponed slot was rescheduled for 4 weeks after that. The rescheduled slot was assigned to a caseworker who was transferred to a different station before it took place. ARR2 WEL2 47391, caseworker pending assignment. Tomás, who had by this point become a fixture of the early morning corridor in the way that things become fixtures when they are reliably present every day, stopped by the bench on the morning the reassignment notification appeared on the corridor display. He had a coffee. He looked at the display. He looked at me. He said he was sorry. I told him the coffee smelled very good. He blinked. He went to work. I want to say something about the coffee, because it matters to the story in a small way that I found instructive. Tomás drank his coffee from a large ceramic mug that he carried from the break room to the front desk every morning, and the smell of it, which was strong and slightly bitter, and not entirely unlike a Vethlan tree bark preparation I had drunk in my youth and found pleasant, reached the bench at the window every morning for the rest of the time I was in that corridor. I do not know whether he thought about this. I think he probably did not. Humans are rarely aware of the olfactory impact of their morning preparations on non-human bystanders, in my experience. But that smell was a consistent point of reference for Min and me across the last several months, and on mornings when Tomás was not on shift and the corridor smelled of nothing in particular, the absence was noticeable. Tomás also had the habit, which I noted in month 17, of pausing at the bench on his way back from collecting the morning cue printout and saying something briefly conversational before continuing to his desk. He asked Min what she was reading. She told him, at length, with an expression that suggested she was deciding in real time whether he was capable of following the explanation. He usually was. He would make a thoughtful remark, Min would consider it, and then he would nod and go to his desk, and the morning would continue. I did not speak to him much. This was not unfriendliness. I had nothing to report, and he had nothing useful to offer on the case, and neither of us was under any illusion about that. But I noted, in the notebook, that he had the quality I had come to think of as the rarest thing I observed in the corridor. He looked at the bench. In month 19, there was a staffing update on the corridor display. Several positions at Keth Station RN 2 had been filled from the RN sector transfer pool. One of the new staff listed was a senior review officer, transferred from Keth Station Veth 7. Her name was Agnes Muir. I wrote it in the notebook, not because I knew it would matter. I write down names because names are worth keeping, and I had learned in 2 years of corridor study that the people who matter are rarely announced. They simply arrive. Month 22. The station had cycled through 2 administrative reviews, one equipment upgrade to the intake processing system that required a 3-week shutdown of the records division, and a staffing restructure that resulted in 17 caseworkers being redistributed across Oren sector offices. Min had a new reading program from the Intermediate Advanced section of the Datapad library, a vocabulary and standard that exceeded most adult non-native speakers, and a carefully maintained collection of smooth floor tiles she had selected from the corridor for their scratch patterns, which she kept in a cloth bag I had sewn for her from the hem of a garment that had long since been replaced. She had stopped going copper when she was frustrated some months earlier, which I took as either emotional maturity or resignation, and preferred to assume was the former. The second notebook was nearly full. On the morning of the second day of the 11th month of Federation Standard Year 249, I arrived at the bench at the time I always arrived, which is approximately 40 minutes before the office opens, because the corridor is quietest then, and the light from the window comes in at an angle that is good for reading and for thinking. Min was with me, as she always was. She was reading. I was writing. I heard footsteps in the main corridor junction at the far end of the hall, the quick, light footsteps of someone walking with purpose but not urgency, the footsteps of someone who was familiar with where they were going and did not need to look around to get there. I did not look up. I had learned not to look up at every set of footsteps. The corridor had a consistent throughput of approximately 40 to 60 personnel per hour during the main shift, and if I had looked up at every set of footsteps, I would have spent most of 2 years craning my neck. The footsteps turned into the corridor and continued down it without slowing. And then they slowed. And then they stopped. I looked up. The woman standing in the corridor was approximately 60 years of age, with the particular quality of stillness that I had come to associate, in my 23 months of observing human institutional workers, with people who had been doing a job for a very long time and had stopped performing it and simply done it. She had gray hair cut short, practical clothing in the standard Federation caseworker's palette, and a large thermos that she was carrying in a way that suggested it was both heavy and important. She was looking at me, not at the corridor, not at the display board, not at the door to room 7, at me, and then at Min, and then back at me. She said, "How long have you been here?" I said, 23 months and 4 days, by my most recent calculation. She said nothing for approximately 5 seconds. In my experience, this is the length of time a human requires to process information that is not wrong, but that they strongly wish were wrong. She said, "I'm Agnes Muir. I work senior review." I said, "I know. You transferred in from Keth Station Vethis 7 in month 19. Your name appeared on the staffing update on the corridor display." She looked at me for another moment. She said, "What's your case number?" I gave her ARR2, WEL2 47391. She took her thermos, crossed the corridor to the door of room 7, pressed the badge panel and pushed the door open. Then she turned back and looked at me with the expression I had not seen on a human face in 23 months, which is the expression of someone who intends to do the thing rather than schedule the thing. She said, "Come in." This is the moment I have been asked about more than any other in the period since. People want to know what it felt like. I understand why they ask. I find it slightly difficult to explain because the feeling was not dramatic, and I think people are expecting something dramatic. It was not a rupture or a flood or a revelation. It was more like a door, which is what it was, and a woman standing beside it, and the ordinary, unremarkable fact that I had been on the outside of it, and now I was being invited inside. I put the notebook in my bag. I took Min's hand. We went in. Agnes Muir's desk was the third from the window in the senior review section of room 7, which is a larger room than I had imagined from the corridor, with 8 workstations and a small conference area at the far end. It was early enough that no one else was in yet. She sat down at her desk, pulled up my file on the display and read it. Not scanned it, read it. I could tell the difference. She started at the beginning and worked forward through 23 months of administrative entries, each of which she read with the focused, unhurried attention of a person who has been doing this for long enough to know which details matter, and which details are the system's way of avoiding the details that matter. She asked me without looking up, "Where are your displacement documents?" I had them in the bag. I had been carrying them in the bag for 23 months. I took them out and gave them to her. She went through them with the same unhurried attention. She asked me 3 questions about the origin codes, which I answered precisely with dates and reference numbers from the notebook. She asked me about Min's documentation. I provided it. She asked me about the civic registration discrepancy in the intake form, the field that Casimir Bauer-Petrov had left blank 23 months earlier, because the reference table did not contain the applicable code. I explained that the applicable code was a Sarath lineage subdesignation that had been added to the Federation Civic Reference System in standard year 238, but had not been incorporated into the Keth Station, a REN2 intake forms reference table, which was running a pre-238 version of the code library. She looked at me. She said, "You found that?" I said I had a good deal of time to read. She was quiet for a moment. She said, "Yes, I imagine you did." She asked me 5 more questions. I answered all of them from the notebook, with reference numbers and dates. She made notes on her own pad. She accessed 4 separate subsections of the Federation Resettlement Administrative Code, confirmed each citation I had given her, and entered the corrections into the file with the steady, unflurried keywork of someone who had filled in enough correction fields to stop finding it remarkable. When she got to the section covering the other 3 PFC category cases I had identified from the corridor display, and I mentioned them by reference number and approximate file date, she stopped typing. She looked at me. She said, "You tracked the other cases." I said the display was there. The information was on the display. I had time to read the display. She said, "And you think they have similar classification issues?" I said I thought it was likely, based on the reference number date range, and the fact that they had remained in PFC category for between 8 and 14 months without resolution. I said I had noted 3 likely commonalities in the intake pathway that might be worth examining. I gave her the reference numbers. She wrote them down. She sat back after that and looked at my file for a moment with the expression of someone doing a calculation that they already know the answer to and do not find the answer pleasing. She said, "I'm going to flag this for expedited review. Given the timeline, it should resolve within 10 days. I said, "That is faster than my previous estimate of 6 to 8 weeks. She said, "Yes, it is. The previous estimate was for the standard queue. Yours doesn't go in the standard queue." I asked her which queue it went in. She said, with the specific flatness of a senior caseworker who is being precise and not editorial, the one that people look at right away. She printed the expedited review confirmation and gave me a copy. She gave Min a small wrapped biscuit from a tin on her desk, which Min accepted with the gravity she applies to all gifts. Agnes looked at Min for a moment and said, "She reads well." I said she had had a great deal of time to practice. Agnes made a sound that was not quite a laugh but was the compressed, inward version of one that humans sometimes produce when a thing is funny and unfortunate in equal measure. That was the meeting, 45 minutes. 23 months of waiting, 45 minutes of conversation, 1 printed confirmation, and 1 biscuit. I went back to the bench to wait for the 10 days. It took 7. The expedited review produced a status update, a case resolution, and a resettlement classification. It also, as I understand it from the subsequent paperwork, produced rather a lot of other things that I was not present for, and that I have pieced together from the official notifications, and from conversations with Agnes Muir, who became, in the weeks that followed, someone I spoke with regularly in a professional capacity that was also, I think, slightly more than purely professional. In the way that things become when two people have spent 45 minutes being precise with each other, and found it unexpectedly comfortable. The station administrator, a man named Elio Brennanosi, who had been in post for 11 of the 23 months I was in the corridor, was informed of the expedited resolution and its associated timeline. He requested the full file. He read the full file. He then, according to Agnes, sat with the full file in front of him for approximately 12 minutes before asking her whether this was accurate. She confirmed that it was. He asked how it had happened. She explained the intake form reference table discrepancy, the caseworker reassignment cycle, and the pending further classification queues review backlog. He asked her how long the review backlog was. She told him. He asked her how many other cases were currently in the pending further classification queue. She told him that too. He asked whether she had the reference numbers for the other cases I had flagged. Agnes told me this later. With what I can only describe as a particular expression I have come to recognize in humans who are finding a situation instructive. She said, "I gave him your list." She said he didn't say anything for a moment. He looked at the list. Then he asked me where I'd gotten it. I told him it came from you. He said, from the case file. She said I told him it came from your notes, your research notes, from sitting in the corridor. He initiated a full review of the PFCQ the same afternoon. The station review produced a 14-page internal report and 3 immediate case resolutions. The 14-page report was flagged for a REN sector administrative oversight, which produced its own review. The sector review produced a 47-page report. The 47-page report was forwarded to the Federation Resettlement Administrative Board, which commissioned a full review of Keth Station, a REN 2's intake protocols, and their handling of Sarath lineage displacement cases specifically. That review produced the 94-page report I mentioned at the beginning. I have read the 94-page report. It is thorough and precisely written and arrives at conclusions that are, taken individually, entirely reasonable. The report identified 4 systemic failures: the outdated reference table in the intake form, the absence of a Sarath lineage classification pathway in the resettlement protocol, the structural gap in the PFCQ's review escalation procedure, and what the report describes as an insufficient mechanism for proactive caseworker outreach to cases in extended inactive status. The report makes 12 recommendations, of which 8 have already been implemented at Keth Station or REN 2. 2 of the 12 recommendations were adopted as sector-wide protocol changes. One of the 12 recommendations resulted in the creation of a new resettlement category, Sarath lineage transitional status, which now appears in the Federation Resettlement Administrative Code as a formally recognized classification with its own intake form, its own reference table codes, and its own review pathway. ARR2 WEL2 47391, case resolved. I think about the 94-page report sometimes. I think about the fact that 23 months produced it, and 45 minutes produced the resolution that produced the review that produced the report, and the 45 minutes was available from the beginning. The desk was there, the room was there, the codes and documents and reference numbers were there, but the 45 minutes required someone to say come in, and for 23 months no one had said it. I do not think this is because the humans in that corridor were indifferent to us. I have said this already and I mean it. Tomás Ferreira Nkosi, who left me a handwritten note when he was transferred to a different posting that said I hope the bench was comfortable, though I know it wasn't, was not an indifferent person. Hiroko Takeshima Osai, who brought Min fruit 4 times and who I later learned had flagged the case twice through internal channels without result, was not an indifferent person. Casimir Bauer Petrov, who processed our intake form on the first morning with genuine care and left one field blank because he could not find the applicable code and did not know where else to put it, was not an indifferent person. Yevapar Kosai, who stamped the medical allocation form in month 6 and made that small sound of compressed surprise, was not an indifferent person. Larissa Obai Johansen, who added the priority flag in month 16 with the competence of someone who genuinely wanted to help and genuinely did not have the authority to do more than flag, was not an indifferent person. They were people doing their jobs in a system that did not have a form for us, and the system had not equipped them with a way to act outside the form. The form was the door, and the door was closed, and everyone who passed through the corridor had a badge for a different door. Agnes Muir arrived 40 minutes early, looked down the corridor and saw us. I have asked her since whether she knew immediately what she was looking at. She thought about it for a moment. She tends to think before speaking, which I appreciate, and she said she knew it was a mother and a child who had been there a long time. She said she could tell by the bag and by the way Min was reading and by the way I was sitting. I asked her what about the way I was sitting. She said, like you were prepared to be there forever, but you hadn't given up on today. This is, I think, one of the more precise things anyone has said to me. I have also asked her why she came in early. She said she always came in early. She said she liked the corridor when it was quiet. She said she brought her thermos and sat at her desk and drank her tea before anyone else arrived because it was the best part of her day. And if she was honest, 40 minutes of peace before the queue opened was the only reason she had lasted 22 years in welfare processing without losing her mind. She is from a town in the north of Scotland, she told me, where the winters are long and the light comes in at a low angle in the mornings, and she never quite lost the habit of being up before the rest of the world, which she says is less about industry than about the specific quality of quiet that exists before the day decides what it is going to be. She did not come in early to find us. She came in early for the tea. I find this, if anything, funnier than the 94-page report. The entire administrative cascade, the PFCQ review, the sector oversight report, the 47 pages, the 94 pages, the new resettlement category now available to all Sarath lineage cases at every Aren sector station. All of it was set in motion by a 60-year-old caseworker from the north of Scotland who arrived before her shift started because she liked the corridor when it was quiet, and she wanted to drink her tea in peace. I told Agnes this once. She said, "Well, I suppose that's what you get for arriving early." I suppose it is. Min and I were assigned resettlement quarters on Keth Station, Aren 2's residential level, 11 days after Agnes said come in. They are small quarters as resettlement allocations go, which is to say they are small by Vethalan standards and probably adequate by human ones. We have a window that faces the Aren secondary star. Min has a reading corner with a lamp. I have a desk. The notebooks are on the desk, both of them. I have started a third. I still think about the corridor sometimes. The bench by the window, the scratched floor tiles, the light at a certain angle. I think about Tamaz's coffee and the fruit Hiroko brought, and the corridor display cycling through ARR2 WEL2 47391 in 15-minute windows, while the caseworkers walked past to their desks. I think about the door to room 7 and the frosted transparency panel in the upper third, and the plaque in Federation standard font. And I think about the 23 months during which the inside of that room and the outside of it were, for us, entirely different worlds, and the single word that moved us from one to the other. Come in. It is not, on reflection, a complicated thing to say. Min asked me recently, in the way she asks questions, which is directly, after considering whether to ask and deciding that she will, whether I was angry about the 2 years. I told her I had thought about it, and concluded that anger was not the most accurate response to what had happened to us. She asked me what was the most accurate response. I told her it was something closer to interested. She considered this for a moment in the way she considers things, and she said, "Interested in what?" I told her, in the fact that the whole thing, the 94 pages, the new category, the 12 recommendations, the sector protocol changes, began because someone came to work early. She thought about this. She went back to her book. After a moment she said, without looking up, "We should send her more biscuits." "I am working on it."